Welcome everyone to today's class, lesson number 7 in the Jewish Law School. And this class, as you can see on the title pulled up on the screen, is about what are the roles of rabbis. If someone says, trust me, I'm a rabbi, or in modern day, if someone says, trust me, I'm a doctor, trust me, I'm a lawyer, what is the role of rabbis in Judaism? And when I say rabbis, of course, I'm not just referring to the rabbis that you're aware of, the ones that are running services in a synagogue, but the overall general rabbinic role. When we say rabbis wrote a book, rabbis said that this is the law, your average rabbi that you're dealing with is mostly someone that is not in the deciding figure, but rather they're the ones just teaching, leading the service, giving over the message of the holiday, but they're not going to be a rabbi on the big level, where you'll call them a senior or the complex and complicated issues. So for example, if someone has a question on what's Torah's view on IVF, when you're giving someone else the pregnancy or someone else is giving birth for your child, is that child considered Jewish? Is it your child? Those are the types of questions when we say we're asking the big rabbis, the ones that are involved with the complicated issues, the ones that are very well versed, or you would refer to them as the rabbi's rabbi, one that rabbis out in the field will consult with because they're the real experts. Sort of like you have the field doctors, the ones that are your family practitioner, the ones that are seeing you for a cold and for the flu. And then you have the world-renowned experts, the ones in the CDC, or in any field. There's the few that are the ones that all other doctors follow. What is their role when it comes to rabbis and the Torah? So many people have this question. I get the question personally a lot. They say, well, the rabbis interpreted it this way, I interpret it another way. What exactly is the power that is given to the rabbis, and what's their job? What's their role that they're supposed to be doing? Are they there to make up laws? Are they there to give their own opinions? And everyone has a valid opinion. This class should answer a lot of questions in that field. So let's start with the introduction. You should see it on the screen. And Elia, if you'd like to read lesson 7, and in your book, it should be on page 122.
Introduction. Lesson 7, Trust Me, I'm a Rabbi, the role of scholars after Sinai. Introduction. At Mount Sinai, amidst thunder and lightning, God gave the Torah to the Jewish people. Encompassed within that divine document included all of the oral Torah as well. All Jewish law comes from Sinai, and Torah isn't changeable structure. It's an absolute and eternal truth. What then is the role of Torah scholars and rabbis? If the Torah doesn't change and its truths are plain and eternal, why do we need rabbis at all? Why can't we just read the books, learn the guides, and call it a day? Their task is to preserve an ancient document thousands of years later, to keep it relevant and meaningful to our times, to help guarantee that you and I and the people next door keep it the way God intended, now and forever.
Beautiful. So this is just an introduction for the class. We're going to go into this in greater detail. And to give an illustration, think of it as the Constitution. We'll discuss this example later in the class. The Constitution was written hundreds of years ago. And till today, we follow American law. Everything is based on the Constitution. If it's not in the Constitution, we say it shouldn't be the law. And yet we have judges. In every state, there are thousands of judges out there. And you might ask, what is the purpose of a judge? They're not there only to enforce the law, because we have police officers for that. Why don't we just say, read the Constitution, see what the law is, and let every police officer decide if someone broke the law or not? We all understand that as much as we have a Constitution, which is clear, it's unchangeable, unless, of course, the Constitution allows for the change. Yet we have judges. And just as the role of judges is to preserve, interpret, and explain the law in each and every scenario that comes up down the line, in other words, you can say the similar is with rabbis. And we're going to get into, of course, in greater detail. Let's start. We're going to divide this class into 3 sections. Section number 1, we pulled up on the screen. And Caroline, if you'd like to read section number 1 of this class. Yeah,
Okay, sorry. Keepers of the law. One of the primary tasks of rabbis throughout the generations is to preserve Torah, namely through transmitting it, providing context, and reconstructing it from the memory in the event of a historical loss.
Okay, so the first role is that one has to make sure that we have the correct law in place. Many things can get distorted over time. Everything fades and goes away at some point or another. If we use an example of physical items, a lot of times those that are trying to promote that we should stop with plastic will give you a list of things, how long it takes for it to disintegrate and not be in existence anymore. You'll have banana peels within a month, they'll break apart. Lettuce can take a little longer, maybe years. You have a slice of bread within 4 weeks can disintegrate on the ground, but water bottles, some of them can take 400 years for it to actually dissolve. A grocery bag can take 1,000 years, which is why Hawaii and many other states don't allow plastic bags, or they don't sell it, promote it, because these are things that take longer to go back into the natural state in the environment. So too, naturally, a Torah that was given thousands of years ago, one can ask himself, how long will a religion or a book last for? How long will it last before people decide we need to change it? And we go back in history, there were many kingdoms, many rulers, many empires that lasted for hundreds of years. But eventually, at some point or another, people said, let's change it. We'll use Hawaii for an example. Hawaii had their standard of living, their laws, their kapu, things that were forbidden, things that were allowed. And eventually came a time where they moved on from it. They changed it. They said, let's upgrade to the times. America, as much as we have our system, it's only a few hundred years old. Going back 300 years ago, they weren't celebrating, or 400 years ago, they weren't practicing American law in America. So too with the Torah, one may ask himself, how long is the Torah going to last for? When God gave this Torah, did he have in mind it's going to last for 100 years, 1,000 years, 2,000 years? And what's the method if you want it to last forever? What do you have to do to make sure that this will not be something that in 300 years or 3,000 years, people will say, you know what, it's time for a Torah upgrade. It's time for the new level. It's time for something that will be living with the times. As some might say, of course, in our opinion, this is incorrect. Some will say the Torah was the most forward-thinking document during its time. It was very well done for 3,000 years ago. However, today's day and age, we're more advanced. We have science, we have technology, we upgraded, and we use parts of the Torah that we appreciate, and we dump, we amend, we change, we recycle some other areas in the Torah that we don't think are any more applicable today's day and age. That is all reasonable when it comes to man-made laws. When it comes to God laws, a definition of God is one that created everything. A God that creates the world, creates time and space. He's above time and space. He is not restricted like humans to only make a document relevant for those times. As bright as the founders of America were, they don't know what the world will look like in 300 years. So they could give you general principles, but they allow for amendments. They allow for things to change. When it comes to the Torah, it's written by God. God knows past, present, and future. God was not unaware that something's going to happen down the line. He was well aware of any changes that will happen in society down the line. And he said, this Torah is an everlasting document that goes on throughout all societies, all countries, all circumstances, all challenges. It will be applicable. So the jobs of the rabbis are there to keep the law and make sure that we have the original text. We're not changing it. We're not amending it. So unlike sometimes mistakenly people will say that the rabbis are there to add their own opinion, the main goal of the rabbi is to make sure that we're having the original text as is without putting in any personal opinions. This is actually interesting. One of the reasons why the Torah has a law that if a written scroll is missing just one letter, if one letter is incorrect, there's over 300,000 letters in the Torah. The 5 books of Moses have over 300,000 letters. If just one is incorrect, the entire Torah is invalid. It cannot be read. And the obvious question is, come on, a guy spent a year writing this. Back in the day, there were no printing presses where it came off the press in a minute. It would take him a long time. You're saying that all his work is worth nothing if he's just missing one letter? Why is that? Okay, let him just change it and write on the side and no, this letter is incorrect. He has to redo it. Now, you don't have to redo the whole Torah, but you have to fix that letter, and until you fix it, it's invalid. I believe, this is one of the explanations, that it was in order to preserve the original text and not have it change, not have different versions of the text, if one allowed that mistakes are okay as long as you just know that it's a mistake. Years later, we'll have multiple different books, and the author knew that he made a mistake here, but a student that reads it won't know that it was a mistake. And therefore, the law is that it's all invalid unless it's fixed. And that allows us to make sure that 3,000 years later, there are still no disputes as to what is the verse in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 6, or any verse in the Torah. We might have different ways of writing the verses. We have that sometimes in the prophets, meaning, do you split one verse into 2 or is it one whole verse? But that's just the number wise. Words wise, the fact that it's all the same is because we were so careful to preserve the original document and make sure that there's no amendments, no changes, no additions, and no one can say, I believe that we should change it to X, Y, and Z. Let's read over here, text number 1. And Max, if you'd like to read this, you could start from the bold line over here, do not, and then read until the question of fill in the blank, and you'll answer the question based on the text.
Do not add or subtract from the Torah. It is very clear from the Torah itself that there is absolutely no change allowed. Text 1, Deuteronomy 4:1-2. You shall not add anything to what I command you or take anything away from it, but keep the commandments of the Lord your God that I enjoin upon you. Fill in the blank, Torah does not change or allow for amendments.
Very good. Beautiful. If one allows for changes and amendments, there is no limit to when you're going to stop. Everybody will say, I believe we should change this. I believe we should change that. As the story goes about the clock in the town that was on a low level, eye level, every guy that came by the clock town, if he saw that the time was incorrect to his watch, instead of changing his watch, he would change the clock in the town. From all the changes that happened throughout the day of the thousands of people changing the town clock, eventually it broke. When one changes themselves, that is never going to break the original. But when everybody starts changing the original, that will eventually make the original fall apart. Okay, let's read the next text. Sheila, if you'd like to read from transmitters and then text number 2. Okay, Sheila, you with us? Okay, maybe she has a hard time with unmuting that. So Elia, if you'd like to read, we'll get back to you, Sheila.
Do you hear me now?
Oh, yes, perfect.
Should I start again?
Yeah. Yeah, please.
Oh, sorry. One of the major roles of the rabbis is not to change or evolve the Torah, God forbid, but to simply preserve the written Torah, and especially the oral Torah, so that it will be available to every Jew in every generation. In the introduction to his magnum opus, the Mishnah Torah, Maimonides gives a detailed list of the chain of instruction all the way from Sinai to the composition of the Mishnah, clearly demonstrating just how important it is to have gatekeepers who guard and transmit the law from generation to generation. More?
Yeah, and now read text
Oh.
number 2.
Okay, Maimonides' introduction to Mishnah Torah. The mitzvah given to Moses at Mount Sinai were all given together with their explanations as implied by the verse. And I will give you the tablets of stone, the Torah and the mitzvah. The Torah refers to the written law, the mitzvah to its explanation. God commanded us to fulfill the Torah according to the instructions of the mitzvah. The mitzvah is called the oral law. Moses, our teacher, personally transcribed the entire Torah before he died. He gave a Torah scroll to each tribe and placed another scroll in the ark as a testimonial.
So we're gonna pause here a second. The text continues. We'll continue with the text.
A little bit, okay?
We'll continue with the text momentarily. So Maimonides is writing here that God gave the Torah to Moses, and he clearly told him to write down and give a copy to each tribe. So every tribe will know exactly what the Torah stated. If it was only one copy and one person had it, then they can give over mixed messages to the other tribes. When you have your own copy, your own version, no one's changing your own copy. Therefore, you get the original and you know exactly how it was written and you know how to fulfill it. There's an interesting example. We'll share it in short. NASA was thinking of sending someone on a mission, but it would be to, in theory, if they wanted to send someone to the nearest star, which is 4.1 light years away. Light years meaning that if we had a rocket that would go 100 times faster than anything we currently have, which of course we don't have such a rocket, but if we would have a rocket going 100 times faster, then it would still take 830 years to reach the closest star, and then another 830 years to get back. So of course, to do such a mission, you wouldn't be able to send just the humans as astronauts themselves because they wouldn't live that long. So rather, they figured if we can send couples that will have children and they'll marry other children on the astronaut, this way we'd be able to have a successful mission. But then they had a big question. If we were to send couples and then the astronauts would teach their children on the rocket ship and their children would teach the next generation, how are we going to be sure that in 200 years from now, in 500 years from now, the children will still find the document on how they should operate this space shuttle? How do we assure that they will find it relevant? What happens if they rebel and they say, you know what, we've never been on this earth. We've never seen NASA. We've never seen everything that our great-grandparents told us about everything out there. The only thing we know of is this space shuttle. We see dark outside. We don't see any world or houses or technology. And we don't see a reason for us to follow this outdated book. Why should we wake up at 6 a.m. and change this filter and press that button? What's the purpose? So one of the scientists said, well, let's look at other groups that figured out how to transfer over a message from generation to generation without people rebelling. And I think this is a beautiful lesson that we could see within Judaism. There's a big question, how do we assure Jewish continuity? How do we make sure that the next generation continues the Jewish faith and they don't go off each on their own way? And the answer, which I believe is the number one most important lesson, is education. When you educate someone from a young age, what's important? That is the greatest potential that they'll continue down the right path. When we educate Judaism from a young age, we teach them how to read. We teach them what's important, what God said. That allows it to continue throughout their life and ensure that they will want to teach it to their children. Even if it's the most beautiful lesson, but if one is only taught it later in life, it's very difficult for one to bring on new change in their life. What they're comfortable to do is usually what we end up doing again and again. So extremely important is education, where one is assuring that the lessons of the Torah are unchangeable. They're going to apply. People will look at it in their life as this is the document I need in order to succeed in my mission. Let's look over here just at this slide. We have here, when it comes to science, we all know that science, of course, changes. Here you have a video. We're just going to play a short clip of it. But 25 things that science had where
24.
it changes.
Lightning can and does strike the same place twice. Since lightning's aim is to find the fastest path to the ground, tall buildings, trees, and such are at the greatest risk because the higher the object, the more likely it is to be struck. 23. The tongue doesn't actually have specific receptor areas for bitter, sour, salty, and sweet flavors. In fact, there's a fifth taste, umami for savory and meaty flavors, and all zones of the tongue can sense all flavors. 22. A penny dropped from the Empire State Building's height won't kill you on street level. Terminal velocity, the maximum speed an object can reach in freefall, for a penny is at its fastest 50 miles per hour, or 80 kilometers per hour. Not enough to give you more than a bump for just a little bit. Do primarily use echolocation to find their way around, but all bats have working eyes. Larger bats even rely on their night vision as opposed to echolocation.
So this is just a short clip showing us how science will believe one thing one day about, let's say, lightning striking twice the same place, and then we upgrade, we learn new things, and we say, you know what, things have changed. The Torah is not in that same category. The Torah is not, we tried this, we thought it was correct, now we realize it's incorrect, let's move on
24.
to the next step. Unlike technology, which is another example, like we mentioned science, technology, if you remember going all the way to the left, the first cell phones, where people felt like they were on top of the world if they had one of those on the left. And then the new innovations was, how do we get a smaller and smaller phone? And then it started the new trend of larger and larger screens, and it's constantly changing. And that's fine with technology. The Torah is not so. As we can call it, Torah is literally set in stone. Set in stone as in we don't change it, which is a beautiful explanation to why God gave Moses tablets engraved in the stone. He didn't write on the stone. He engraved it in the stone where it was carved out. Something that's carved out of the stone is a lot more difficult for one to change, because the Torah's message was it's unchangeable. And as we read from the verse before, from Deuteronomy chapter 4, don't subtract from the Torah and don't add to the Torah. Let's continue reading the text that we had inside from Maimonides, and where he explains about how the Torah is passed down from generation to generation to make sure that we get it exactly in the original form. And Max, if you'd like to continue reading the mitzvah.
The mitzvah, i.e., the explanation of the Torah, Moses did not transcribe. Instead, he commanded it verbally to the elders, to Joshua, and to the totality of Israel. For this reason, it is called the oral law. Shall I continue?
Yeah. Till the end of the page. I'll scroll down as you read.
Though the oral law was not transcribed, Moses, our teacher, taught it in its entirety in his court to the 70 elders. Eleazar, Pinchas, and Joshua received the tradition from Moses. In particular, Moses transmitted the oral law to Joshua, who was his primary disciple, and instructed him regarding it. Similarly, throughout his life, Joshua taught the oral law. Many elders received the tradition from him. Eli received the tradition from the elders and from Pinchas. Samuel received the tradition from Eli in his court. David received the tradition from Samuel in his court. Elijah received the tradition from Achiah of Shiloh in his court. Elisha received the tradition from Elijah in his court. Rabbi Yehuda, the son of Rabban Shimon and referred to as Rabbeinu HaKadosh, our saintly teacher, received the tradition from his father, from Rabbi Elazar ben Shammua, and from Rabban Shimon and his colleagues. Rabbeinu HaKadosh composed the Mishnah.
Beautiful. So we just had a long quote where he's explaining how tradition was passed down, unlike we mentioned in science and technology, where we're constantly changing and disproving what we had previously. The Torah is built precisely the opposite. We never contradict what we had previously. The jobs of the rabbis are not to show how previous generations made mistakes. The job is to apply previous principles to new situations. And if it appears that we're making something up, that's just a lack of understanding what the rabbi is doing. The rabbis are there to preserve. And let's read this question inside. Eliyav, if you'd like to read, based on the text we just read this question and tell us what you think the answer is.
According to Maimonides, what was the role of rabbis throughout the generations? A, to develop new Torah laws as needed. B, to transmit what they were taught to others. And C, to apply Torah principles to changing times. C and B. Wait. Yeah. Wait.
No, so
Yeah,
you are
right?
correct.
Sorry, I like read B wrong, but yeah, C.
No, so you are no. You're correct on both of them. C is true, which we'll get to that. That's going to be point 2 and 3 of the class. But the question over here was specifically according to Maimonides, meaning the text we read. And the answer,
According to him, then it was B.
correct. The answer is B, like you mentioned, which is the main focus was to transmit what they were taught, not to make up anything, not to give your own opinion, but to give over what you learned. So C is true, but it's not specifically what he was mentioning here. What Maimonides was teaching us was answer number B. And let's read this slide. Sheila, if you'd like to read what we have here on the screen.
Hello? Do you hear me?
Yeah, now we hear you.
Rabbis and scholars are simply transmitters of Torah.
Very good. So that's the main role of what a rabbi is there to do. And let's read over here another text regarding reconstructing, which is aligned with what we mentioned earlier about preserving the text. And this is where it goes a little bit further. Caroline, if you'd like to read reconstructing and then text number 3, we're going to scroll down.
Okay, reconstructing. There is more to maintaining than simply memorizing. Unfortunately, the teachings of Moses were not always pristinely preserved. When traumatic events caused details to be forgotten, it was the job of the leading Torah scholars to use their skills in Torah to study and restore the missing details. The following passage from the Talmud describes this process of reconstructing lost Torah study from the memory as beginning immediately after the passing of Moses. Text 3, Talmud. It is taught that in Baratia, 1,700 derivatives, verbal analogies, and a how do you say that?
It's referring to details of the scribes of what they were.
Okay, minuetide of the scribes were forgotten during the days of mourning for Moses. Rabbi Abahu says, even so, Ontel, son of Kenaz, restored them through his sharp mind.
Okay, so we just read that text from the Talmud, and let's have Elia, if you'd like to read the explanation, what we just read over there from that text in the Talmud.
Othniel ben Kenaz was the first of the Jewish judges in the land of Israel. While Moses was still alive, any issue, any question in Torah could easily be resolved by simply turning to Moses, the person who heard the entire thing from God himself. It was direct access. But after Moses' passing, that option was no longer available. Thus began a process in which the laws were slowly forgotten. It was only when Othniel came around and used tools of deduction and other such principles of Torah study that he was able to restore the forgotten teachings.
Very good. So this is, besides for preserving the text, their job is that when necessary to figure out what was forgotten, that was the role of the rabbis. They were studying it in order to deduce with Torah principles, what is it that we're missing? Let's use an example here. Question number 1, Sheila, if you can.
Can you complete the pattern 3, 4, 6, 9, 13?
Yeah. So this is a pattern, and I'll share the answer.
Well, it's 1, and then it goes 2, and then it goes 3, and then it goes 4. So I guess the next one is 5.
Very good. Very good. You got that correctly. Correct.
That's what it looks like. It's 1 more, 2 more, 3 more, 4 more. I guess the next one is 5 more.
Correct. Very good. So it would be 18, and the next one would be 24, which is 6 more, and then 31, 7 more. So Sheila, you could be hired as a rabbi. You figure that out.
Let's not get carried away. Maybe a kindergarten math teacher.
So very good. So these are patterns, or if you had this picture, one might ask, can you complete this picture? So we would expect, I don't know how to complete it. And we would assume that most people watching the video or seeing this on the screen can't complete it. But what would we say? We would say, well, if you have an experienced archaeologist, someone that is dealing with this their whole life, they learned everything about that era, they know about how to read these types of handwritings, and they know what was there before and after, we would assume that they can put this together and fill in the gaps of what is missing. So too, would we say the same thing with a rabbi? They're not filling in, I just imagine this would be the answer. They're telling us, based on everything I've studied, either I know a lot of math or I know a lot of patterns, and therefore this is what the pattern is, or based on all my previous study of archaeology, this is probably what's supposed to be there. So too, a rabbi is filling in based on knowledge from everything else that he studied in the Torah. They're deducing what would be the case, what would be the law in X scenario, which they don't have a clear precedent from beforehand. Yeah, Caroline, would you like to read the
Sure.
next part of the screen?
Making connections. There is another role of rabbis, that is to find proof for the oral Torah written within the written Torah. This idea is articulated by Rabbi Shaim Im Atar. Rabbi Shaim Im Atar, or Chaim to Vairika. In his wisdom, God encoded all of the oral Torah that he taught Moses into the written Torah, but he did not tell Moses where exactly all the oral Torah is hinted to within the written Torah. This is the mission of the Jewish people whose toil in Torah to find the sources for the Hachnat of the oral Torah in the written Torah. Thus, our sages composed works such as the Midrash and the Mishnah, the teachings therein all encoded in the scripture. To this very day, the holy task of the Jewish people is to read the verses carefully and discover the sources for the received teachings of the oral Torah.
Beautiful. So again, over here, he says another aspect, which is not to make up new laws, but finding the source, finding where it's hinted to in the Torah. I'll use over here a slide to bring out an example. If one is really involved with a school of art, they'll say all colors have, from a limited source, you can make all the colors, right? And for anyone that's involved in this field, you'll say just put a few colors and you can make any other color. So too, one that's involved in the Torah study becomes their life, becomes their profession. They try to make connections and discover new areas of the Torah. Where is it mentioned to? How do we put things together in order to derive at the conclusion that we already have? So let's read a summary for section number 1 of this class. And Max, if you'd like to read the summary, and then we'll move on to section number 2.
We have covered big idea number 1. One of the primary tasks of the rabbis throughout the generations is to preserve Torah, namely through transmitting it, providing context, and reconstructing it from memory in the event of a historical loss. In the following section, we will explore big idea number 2.
Beautiful. Okay, now read, Max, continue reading big idea number 2.
Applying the law. A second task of rabbis is to apply the Torah, deriving new laws for changing times. Using traditional methods of scholarship handed down from Sinai, the rabbis apply the law for every situation.
Very good. So let's ask a question, and Elia, this question would be yours. What are the 3 branches of the United States government?
Legislative, judicial, and executive.
Very good. And what is the difference, Sheila? What's the difference in roles for these 3 groups? Of course, they're not here to compete against each other. Each one has their own responsibilities.
The judicial makes the laws, the executive like oversees it, and what was the other one? I forgot.
We have the judicial, the legislative, like the House.
The legislative makes the laws, and the one is the legislative puts, it's like the courts. The executive is like the president, and the other is like Congress, and they're supposed to represent the people.
Correct. So you have the House and the Senate, they create the laws. They sit there the whole day and deciding what's the new law in the US. The executive, his job is to enforce the law. And the judicial, they evaluate the laws and they discuss where it applies. Their job is to dissect the laws and say, number one, does it align with the Constitution? And if there's a discussion as to does the law apply in this specific case, that's what the judicial sit there and they discuss, do we think that this is included in the law or is it not included? So let's use a few examples. And the question would be to Carol Ann, if we were to create social health care, who is the role, whose job would it be to create social health care from these three branches?
It would be the legislative. From the executive, the legislative,
Now,
and the judicial.
Oh, and now who would decide if social health care is constitutional or not? Max, whose role would it be to decide if it qualifies or doesn't?
The judicial.
Right, very good. The judicial, and then who would be the responsibility to enforce it, make sure it happens, to put in place a system, hire the right people? Elia, whose job would that be?
The executive branch.
Very good. Okay, very good. So we have a class well aware of these categories. We'll use another example. Let's say determining if refusal to sell a wedding cake to a certain person that's getting married, not according to your beliefs, is that considered discrimination or not? So that would be up to the judicial. They would, in the courts, they would decide, are you discriminating or are you not? Who makes the laws or outlawing discrimination? That, of course, would be the Congress. They would decide, the House, they would vote on it if discrimination is something prohibited or not. And so on, creating lockdowns, that is something that is in the executive power. Based on these roles, let's pull it up on the screen and we'll ask this question. And this question will be for Sheila. Which branch, you read the question and then tell me what you think.
Which branch of the American system is the role of the rabbis most similar to?
What do you think is the answer?
I would think it's to carry out the laws, to make sure that the laws are obeyed. Because they don't really make the laws.
So that actually, correct. You are correct.
You don't really make the laws. You make sure that they're carried out correctly.
So you are right that they don't make the laws. Of course, in Judaism, who makes the laws? It's God. God is the legislator in Judaism. So God would be like the House. God would be like Congress because he makes the laws. And the rabbi's job in Maimonides, or the Torah actually discusses it. There were two groups within the society. One, their job was to enforce the law. Those were the guards, the police officers. Their job was to make sure everyone is following the law. And then there were the rabbis, which their job was like the judicial branch. Their job was not to run around after people, making sure that they're doing the right thing, but their job was to explain the law, define when it applies, and read from the law and say, is this scenario a new case or is this something old? So the rabbis, this clarifies, don't make up the laws. The rabbis are not compared to Congress or the Senate. That's not their department. God is the only one making laws. The rabbis are just there to help us define, is this within the Torah guidelines? Is this what God meant or is this not what God meant? Let's use another example here. Application of laws. It's extremely important because if you read through the Constitution, you won't find anything covering scenarios when it comes to cars or when it comes to planes. They didn't discuss it. It wasn't something relevant then. But yet we still follow the Constitution to base our laws in those categories because the general principles were given over by those that made the Constitution. So too, when it comes to God giving over the general principles to Moses. And then the rabbis say, okay, let's see, what did God say in general? And God included in the general principles all details that will come about in later stages. So like the judicial branch, the rabbis don't create anything new. Rather, they're applying God-given principles to changing times. So the Torah doesn't change, times change, and therefore the Torah laws can be applied by one that studies the Torah well, can be applied in every case and scenario without a necessary need to change the Torah. Rather, understand what does the Torah want me to do in this new scenario that came about.
Good.
Let's read over here the following medrash. And Carol Ann, if you'd like to read from
The following midrash highlights the fact that God did not give Moses the entirety of the Halachic system as we have it today. Midrash Shemot Rabbah. He gave the Torah to Moses. Rabbi Abahu taught that all 40 days that Moses was in the heavens, he would learn Torah. Did Moses really learn the entire Torah? It does not say about the Torah that it is longer than the land and wider than the sea. How can Moses have learned it all within 40 days? Rather, God taught Moses the principles.
Very good. It's very good. So we see over here again, God gave us all the principles. He made the laws. He made not just the laws, but how one should dissect the laws. Those principles come from God too. So God didn't say, these are the laws. Now every person can just make up how they want to study it. We're going to have it momentarily in the next quote. Let's read over here. Elia, if you'd like to read similarly. And then we'll see over here that God gave us the method how we should dissect the Torah principles in every scenario.
Similarly, Maimonides describes that Torah scholars of future generations also had the role of filling in the details of the mitzvot based on the Torah principles. Text 6. Know that each commandment that God gave to Moses was given to him with its explanation, and everything that Moses taught to Joshua or any of the elders, there is nothing to say about it, and no disagreements arose about it. Regarding matters which did not hear an explanation from the mouth of the prophet Moses, they extrapolated laws by propositions from the 13 exegetical principles through which the Torah is expounded, which were given at Mount Sinai. Do I keep going to the bottom thing?
Yeah, so now you can read over here this question, which role?
Which role of Torah scholars is described here? A, creating new laws based on their own wisdom and prophecy. B, interpreting Torah to decide on the application of laws. And C, transmitting Torah from their teachers to future generations. Do I answer this?
What do you think the answer is?
I think in this, it kind of describes C, because.
Right.
Yeah.
So it does mention this as well, of course, that they have to pass it down, whatever they received from Moses, but it also has the point over here of point B, where they're interpreting the Torah to decide on the application of the laws. That's in the second paragraph. Whatever they didn't hear clearly, they got general rules and how they should interpret it, and that's the way they would go about saying this is what the Torah is mentioning over here. This is what it's referring to in this case. So let's use over here this next slide. There's an interesting story. The Talmud says that, actually we have it over here. It's the next, let's first read the text and then we'll go on to this question. And Max, if you'd like to read text number 7.
Rabbi Yehuda says that Rav says, when Moses ascended on high, he found God sitting and tying crowns on the letters of the Torah. Moses said before God, Master of the universe, who is preventing you from giving the Torah without these additions? God said to Moses, there is a man who is destined to be born after several generations, and Akiva ben Yosef is his name. He is destined to derive from each and every one of these crowns mounds upon mounds of halakot. It is for his sake that the crowns must be added to the letters of the Torah.
Okay, continue.
Moses said before God, Master of the universe, show him to me. God said to him, return behind you. Moses went and sat at the end of the 8th row in Rabbi Akiva's study hall and did not understand what they were saying. Moses' strength waned as he thought his Torah knowledge was deficient. When Rabbi Akiva arrived at the discussion of one matter, his students said to him, my teacher, from where do you derive this? Rabbi Akiva said to them, it is a halakha transmitted to Moses from Mount Sinai. When Moses heard this, his mind was put at ease, as this too was part of the Torah that he was to receive.
Very good. So let's explain this story. Moses, the guy that received the Torah from God directly, said, I don't know why you're having crowns on some of the letters. I believe here, yep, let's pull up this slide. If you see, these are the Torah letters, the way they're written in the Torah. And notice that the letter Shatnez Gad, which is the Shin, Tzadik, Ayin, Nun, Gimel, Zayin, and Tes. They have those 3 crowns coming up. Why are they there? So Moses didn't know. And Moses says, God, why are you delaying the giving of the Torah till you write all these crowns? And God says, because there will be a man later on that will understand and learn mountains of laws from each one of these crowns. And Moses says, I don't even know what's the reason. Let me go to this guy's class in the future. So God puts him in this spiritual time machine where he can see later generations how Rabbi Akiva, which we don't have a photo of him, and to point out that's of course not a photo of Moses. We don't know how he looked. So Rabbi Akiva lived about 2,000 years ago, and Moses travels ahead of time about 1,300 years. He goes to a study of Rabbi Akiva and he's totally lost. Can you imagine someone that gave the law doesn't understand a teacher that's teaching the law? Not because he doesn't speak the language, but Rabbi Akiva's class was so complex, so deep, that Moses himself wasn't able to follow. And Moses felt ashamed. He said, why am I giving the Torah? Why am I the one to receive it from God if this guy knows it so much better than I do? Until Rabbi Akiva was asked the question in his class, how do you know this law? And he said, there's no proof for it. It was just received from Moses at Sinai and he gave it down to us, and that's how we know it. When Moses heard that, that calmed him down. That made him realize that yes, he doesn't know all the details that are derived from the Torah that he's giving, but that everything is included in his teachings. So Moses wasn't the most brilliant man, and the Torah doesn't testify about him that he was the wisest of all men. The Torah says he was the one that gave down the principles. He didn't know every detail that's included in all the principles. God knew all those details. And years later, rabbis were dissecting from the rules that Moses gave to what are the correct details that we learn out from it. So someone gives over a message that has in it codes. They don't need to know all the coding that can be derived from the message. They gave over the message and it's all included in there. So too Moses gave over the Torah, and within it, he knows that he's well aware that there's many messages that were deep that he didn't know, but none of them contradict what he said. His messages were given by God, and therefore God told him what to say that would include hidden messages that he was unaware of. So who's greater? Who knew more? Rabbi Akiva knew more, but he knew detail by detail, versus Moses was given over by God general principles that included everything. He couldn't dissect it all into the greatest detail as later generations, but it's all from the one source of God giving it over to Moses. And we'll read text number 8, which brings out this point from the Medrash. Caroline, if you'd like to read text number 8, and then the next advice.
Okay, Midrash Bam Idbar Rabbah. Matters that were not revealed to Moses were revealed to Rabbi Akiva and his colleagues. Rabbis and Torah scholars applied the Torah in both practical and moral sense. On a practical level, they had to develop halakot for arising cases, but also morality with changing times and cultural norms. Rabbis have always seen it as their duty to make Torah applicable and relevant to modern times.
Very good. Okay, and summary. Sheila, if you'd like to read summary. Oh, sorry, you wanted to say something?
No.
Oh, okay.
We have covered big idea number 2. The second task of rabbis is to apply the Torah, deriving new laws for changing times. Using traditional methods of scholarship handed down from Sinai, the rabbis apply the law for every situation. In the following section, we will explore big idea number 3.
Very good. And Sheila, if you'd like to continue.
Okay.
Number 3.
Okay. Old innovations. All of halakha is from Sinai because it is all divinely inspired from the same Torah received by Moses. Though the Torah was given thousands of years ago, Torah study is a dynamic activity that accesses a live spiritual energy that continues to carry God's voice in everything we learn.
Very good. So this is the third idea we're going to discuss from the class. And if you're losing track of all the ideas at the end, we're going to recap it all together. So let's read source number 1. And Max, if you'd like to read from Sinai and then read text number 9.
From Sinai, do rabbis have the ability to make things up? In what way are these new halakot considered divine, if at all? Midrash Kohelet Rabbah. The Bible, Mishnah, Halakot, Tosefta, supplemental oral law, and Agadta, non-legal Talmudic matter, and even what an expert student will in the future teach, was already given as a halakha to Moses at Mount Sinai. Rabbi Berachia said in the name of Rabbi Chalbo, this is analogous to one who had a stone wrapped up in his pocket that fell out. To replace it with a bigger stone is impossible, as there isn't enough space. To replace it with a smaller stone is impossible, as it wouldn't fill the space. So we must replace it with something that fits exactly. Thus, if you hear Torah from a Torah scholar, it should be considered in your eyes that you heard it from Sinai. For if it is true, if it fits, then it was really always there.
Very good. So the number 1 principle here is, as much as a rabbi is innovating, nothing they're saying is brand new. It's all finding the details that weren't noticed before and learning from what God gave to Moses. God gave this unlimited rolled up document that you could just keep unrolling and there's more and more there. Nothing will contradict what was taught earlier, but there's always new discoveries to be made. And that's the main role today, where we're discovering new aspects of what the Torah is referring to in new modern technology and modern society, new lessons that it's deriving, but never contradicting previous messages. It's all one long message that has unlimited depth. Let's read over here the next text. And Caroline, if you'd like to read.
Rabbi Steve Hirsch Helhays adopts the stance when explaining the above story about Rabbi Akiva and Moses. Rabbi Ziv Hirsch Chajes Torat Hanim Esai on the oral law. God showed Moses all of the derivations as well as a process, how many thousands of halakot were innovated. Moses did not recognize them, and it appeared to him that they were additions to the Torah. Rabbi Akiva laid that suspicion to rest when he said, it is a halakha transmitted to Moses from Sinai. In other words, nothing was innovated, insomuch as all of these new halachot were derived from the principles of interpretation given to Moses at Sinai, as applied to the text of the written Torah. Moses was pacified when he saw that hundreds of halachot can indeed be derived from a single written letter of the written Torah.
Very good. So he explains that point, that it was all from the beginning. Let's use this example over here. Where's that slide? Oh, okay. They don't have the slide here. Sorry about that. But if we were to have a picture of thousands of things within the picture, and you have a list of things that are found, and there's the question of, can you spy this item in the picture? So it says, can you find a small this, a small that? And you have these games for kids where there could be hundreds, tens of things, and you have to find them. as much as one finds, there's always more and more detail, and one can look into it, not contradicting anything that you found already, but there's more to be found. Let's read this next text. Eliyav, if you'd like to read Divinely Inspired.
A similar idea exists in secular legal systems as well. For example, the United States Constitution is a limited document, but each word is mined for a precise legal meaning to develop new laws long after it was written. One important difference is that Jewish law stems from God, not from humans. Therefore, in addition to the skills and sharp mind needed to closely read the written Torah, deriving new halachot from the written Torah requires something more, divine inspiration. While God does not tell the Torah scholars what the halakha should be, they must be able to access God's wisdom. This emerges from a passage in the Talmud, which refers to Torah scholars as prophets, even though, as we will see in the next lesson, prophecy is not allowed to adjudicate halachic disputes. Through their wisdom, piety, pursuit of truth, Torah scholars can access God's mind, so to speak.
To explain what we're getting to over here, and that is, one can always ask, well, what happens if I'm trying to understand the Torah? I'm trying to get to the final conclusion, and I use all the methods, I study the Torah, I know the principles. Maybe I'm mistaken. Maybe I'm saying this is what God wants, and really it's not what God wants. I could be off. It's possible. This is where we say God is ultimately wanting us to learn it in this method, and he gives us a divine inspiration, which means he gives the right idea in our mind that if we use the proper principles, he says, I'll make sure that you'll head off to the right conclusion. I'll make sure that I put into your mind, you're going to come up with the correct answer and you won't be totally off. Because ultimately, just as God gave it over to Moses, he wants us to participate, but yet know the truth. So he gives us this form of prophecy when one is studying Torah with the proper methods to make sure that we arrive at the final correct conclusion. And let's read the text inside. This is from the Talmud. Max, if you'd like to read text number 11.
Talmud Tractate Baba Batra 12a. From the day that the temple was destroyed, prophecy was taken from the prophets and given to the sages. Is that to say that a sage is not fit to be a prophet? This is what was meant to be said. Even though prophecy was taken from the prophets, it was not taken from the sages.
Very good. So let's read that question.
According to this passage of Talmud, what do Torah scholars need to apply Torah?
And the answer is that they merit for divine assistance when innovating in the Torah. So it's not exclusively that every prophet is going to be a rabbi, but when one is trying to study the Torah properly, they're trying to derive the lessons of the Torah, God assists them and gives them divine assistance in order to make sure that they're heading down the right road. Let's read over here these two quotes. And Sheila, if you'd like to read from our Torah scholars until the bottom of the page.
Are Torah scholars prophets? But what does that mean? Are sages really prophets? The local rabbi may be a great man, but he's probably not a prophet. So what's the idea here? The explanation emerges from the Torah's account, God giving of the Torah. Shall I read the rest?
Yeah.
God spoke these words, Velo Yasaf, to your whole congregation at the mountain with a mighty voice out of the fire and the dense clouds. He inscribed them on 2 tablets of stone, which he gave me. Velo Yasaf on Kalis, translate is as God's speech did not cease, for his voice is strong and is eternal.
So this, we're coming to explain over here this point. Of course, Torah scholars are not prophets like we had back in the day, but based on the verse, when God gave us the 10 Commandments, it says in the Hebrew, Kol Gadol V'lo Yasav. God's voice was a strong, mighty, large, great voice, and it did not cease. It didn't stop. Rather, it was existing forever. Our voice has a limit how far it can travel, how the distance, the strength, but God's voice was unlimited. It doesn't only mean literally, physically, it was unlimited voice, but rather God's message is one that wasn't just around at the time of Moses receiving the Torah at Sinai, but God was giving over the power of studying the Torah for generations to come. God was saying, not just to Moses am I teaching, but anyone that wants to seriously study Torah, God will assist them in their study to understand it properly. Let's read that explanation over here in this following text. Caroline, if you'd like to read.
What does it mean that God's voice at Sinai did not cease? Do we still hear God saying the 10 Commandments? Rabbi Avram Shimshur explains. Rabbi Avram Shimshur, Torah Time, to Baba Metzia, 5 AD. This is quite puzzling. What does it mean that the voice of God at Sinai exists forever? This is what it means. When the Torah was given, God sent down a spiritual force into the world that contained all the written and oral Torah, Midrash, and Agat. The spiritual force exists forever. Each Torah scholar who studies Torah for the sake of heaven is imbued with that spiritual force, thereby meriting to innovate new Torah ideas. This is what the sages meant when they said that whatever an expert student will innovate in the future was already said to Moses at Sinai. This refers to the great voice of God that does not stop. The voice of God at Sinai that still exists today will exist forever.
So what he's saying, in other words, is that there's a spiritual force that God brought into the world when he gave the 10 Commandments. And that is something that anyone can tap into and access that spiritual force when we study the Torah. It's God's modern form of prophecy where he assists one to connect to God and his message by studying the Torah, even till today's day and age. We find this also in the blessing. And Max, if you'd like to read over here, Torah, living experience, and then the text 15.
The notion of a perpetual voice of God in Torah is reflected in the blessing we recite prior to Torah study. Blessed are you, God, King of the universe, who chose us from among all the peoples and gave us his Torah. Blessed are you, God, the one who gives us the Torah. What is unique about the language of this blessing?
Yeah, so what the question is, what is unique about it? And seemingly it sounds like a blessing. Thank you, God, for giving us the Torah. But if you notice these few words that I'm going to highlight, it doesn't say thank you, God, for giving us the Torah. It says the one who gives us the Torah. Gives is present. God didn't just give us the Torah 3,000 years ago and say, please study it forever. He actively, each and every day, has that connection where he's giving us the Torah anew. He's giving us again that opportunity of hearing his message and connecting with him by studying the Torah. And like we'll pull up over here on the slide, God is called the one who gives the Torah in present tense because he's not just connecting with us from 3,000 years ago, but actively available to connect with when one studies the Torah till today's day and age. And Elia, if you'd like to read this one and text 16.
There is much significance to this language as it reflects our attitude to Torah study. A person who studies Torah is, in essence, having a rendezvous with God. Even today, thousands of years after the Torah was initially given at Sinai. This idea was beautifully expressed by Rabbi Soloveitchik in a 1975 talk to the Rabbinical Council of America. The following is an excerpt from a much longer talk. The study of Torah has a great cathartic healing impact upon me. It is rooted in the wondrous experience I always have when I open up a Gemara Talmud. Somehow, when I open a Gemara, either alone or when I am in company, when I teach others, I have the impression, don't call it hallucination, I have the impression that I hear soft footsteps of somebody invisible who comes in and sits down with me, sometimes looking over my shoulder. The idea is not a mystical idea. The Mishnah in Avot, the Gemara in Brachot speaks of an individual who sits and engages in Torah study, invites Shekhinah, God, to sit with him. We all believe that the Noten HaTorah, the one who gives us the Torah, has never deserted the Torah, and he simply accompanies the Torah. Wherever the Torah has a rendezvous, an appointment, a date with somebody, he is there. Therefore, the study of Torah has never been for me dry, formal, intellectual performance. No matter how important a role the intellect plays in Limud HaTorah, Torah study, you know very well that I place a great deal of emphasis upon the intellectual understanding and the analysis of the halachot. We avail ourselves of the most modern methods of understanding, of constructing, of inferring, of classifying, of defining, and so forth and so on. So there's no doubt that the intellect plays a tremendous role in Limud HaTorah. However, Talmud learning, Torah, is more than intellectual performance. It is a total, all-encompassing and all-embracing involvement, mind and heart, will and feeling, the center of the human personality, emotional man, logical man, voluntaristic man. All of them are involved in the study of Torah. Talmud Torah is basically for me an ecstatic experience in which one meets God.
Beautifully read, thank you. So he explains this very well, that it's not just one is studying another intellectual subject, but this is a meeting with the giver of the Torah. Each and every person has that opportunity when we study the Torah. We're going to read one more text and then we're going to summarize this section and the entire class. From the first and then text 17.
Oh, sorry, you cut out there. I didn't realize you called on me. The first Chabad Rebbe, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, spoke of this remarkable union that a human creates when he or she studies Torah, literally ingesting God into their very being, quite an ecstatic experience. Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, Tanya, Likutei Amarim. When a person understands with his intellect such a halakhic verdict in accordance with the law as it is set out in the Mishnah, Gemara, or Posachim codes, he has thus comprehended, grasped, and encompassed with his intellect the will and wisdom of God simultaneously. The intellect is also wrapped up in the divine will and wisdom. Inasmuch as when it comes to understanding Torah, the Torah is integrated in the soul and intellect of a person and is absorbed in them. It is called bread and food for the soul. Just as physical bread nourishes the body as it is absorbed in his very inner self and is then transformed into the very blood from which he lives, so too it is with understanding Torah. When one concentrates his or her mind until the Torah is absorbed in his or her very brain, they are united with it and become one with it. It then becomes nourishment and a source of life for the soul from God who gives life.
Beautiful. So what he explains over here is that Torah study is like nourishment for the soul. Just as when you eat something, you become one with it. The bread doesn't just go through you and leave and you stay the same person. You digest it, it becomes part of your blood, and that becomes a part of who you are. Torah study is us uniting with the Torah, which is, of course, the giver of the Torah. Uniting with God, it's the soul digesting food and uniting with it in a way that we cannot define in other sense, where we don't think we're united with something we study. Specifically, Torah gets us connected with God like no other method can. We understand it, and it encompasses us. And like we have here in this little scenario, where you'll have, think of it as like a bear hug. It's a little bit more than just that, because it's actually digesting inside of you, but it's God giving us a giant hug. It's us connecting with God on the greatest level possible for a human being. So let's summarize the third section, and then we'll summarize the whole class. Caroline, if you'd like to read the summary for section number 3.
When we regular flesh and blood people learn Torah, it's like we're giving God a giant bear hug. No wonder our innovations are considered to be from Sinai. For when we are hugging God, how can we get it wrong? Summary. We have covered big idea number 3. All of the halakha is from Sinai because it is all divinely inspired from the same Torah received by Moses. Though the Torah was given thousands of years ago, Torah study is a dynamic activity that assesses a live spiritual energy that continues to carry God's voice in everything we learn.
Very good. So these are the 3 points we gave. The primary task of the rabbis was to preserve the Torah and deduce anything that was forgotten. A second task is deriving new laws to apply for changing times, only using traditional methods. And then the third aspect is actually available for everyone. Of course, anyone has this right of studying Torah, and that is connecting with God through the Torah, and that allows us to access it in a way like Moses did, where everything that we study is given by God to Moses. Moses got the general principles, and when we study the details, we are connecting with God and giving the right conclusions for what the scenario is referring to, what God wants us to do in each and every case. So let's read this key points. We're going to go through, each person will read one and we'll go around. Start with Sheila, if you'd like to read point number 1.
The Torah is perfect, eternal, and unchangeable.
There you go. So that was the first point we mentioned. It's not something that we amend. The number 1 principle, we said this, a clear verse in the Torah. God says, do not add or subtract from the Torah. So rabbi's job is not to change the Torah how they see fit. It's a closed document engraved in stone. That's the key. Okay, Eliah, point number 2.
The job of rabbis and Torah scholars is to preserve and maintain the Torah.
Oh, okay. I got cut off there, I think. But yes, the job of the rabbis is to maintain, preserve the Torah. Their job is specifically to allow it to be transcribed from generation to generation, and we shouldn't lose the original text. Max, if you could read point number 3.
Rabbis can reconstruct parts of Torah that have gone missing over time.
Right, which we mentioned that point, that it happened after Moses passed away, using the methods that Moses taught. Caroline, point number 4.
Rabbis also make connections and find sources for the oral laws in the written law.
Right, that was one of the commentaries mentioned in section number 1, that it's an additional aspect that we're doing of finding where's the original source. Sheila, point number 5.
Rabbis apply the Torah principles to, but I can't read the end because it's cut off.
1 second. If I switch.
Yeah, okay. Oh, where did it go?
5. Read 5.
Okay, there it is. Rabbis apply the Torah principles to the many new cases that were not mentioned clearly by God or Moses.
Okay, so again, to clarify, it's not that they make up scenarios. They make up what God wanted. They understand that God always intended to give over all the details, but he gave it over as general principles. Moses received these principles. Moses himself maybe was unaware of every detail that could be learned from it, but it never contradicts previous laws. It's all there as part of the job to understand, dissect it, and learn what it is that God wants in every case. Okay, point number 6, Eliah.
There are 13 principles by which to study it and derive new halachot.
We said this is a little bit different than modern day law, where you have the Constitution and each judge can base how he understands it, but there's no principles that were given in how one should study the Constitution. With God, we say this actually, most prayer books have this before the beginning of the morning prayers. It's a paragraph called Rabbi Yishmael Omer. Rabbi Yishmael used to say that with 13 principles, the Torah is studied. And one of them, just to give you an example, is called a kal v'chomer. Kal v'chomer means if you have the Torah prohibit something in a more lenient case, I assume that this law will apply in a more stringent case. If this person is not allowed to do it, so for example, this is something where the Torah says you're prohibited from marrying your granddaughter. So even though it doesn't say clearly that one is prohibited from marrying a daughter, because a granddaughter is prohibited, for sure a daughter is prohibited. So these are examples where we can learn out that if this applies in a more lenient case, how much more so in a more severe case. That's one of the principles. There's many more, and there's lots of laws about when these principles apply. And for that, of course, you have the whole Talmud. Max, point number 7.
There are 13 principles by which, oh wait, that was 6.
Excellent. Yeah.
New halachot are essentially encompassed in the Torah given at Mount Sinai.
Right? So it's not made up, but rather they're all found within God giving it over to Moses. God intended that all these laws will be learned out at later stages when we follow the guidelines. Carol Ann?
In Jewish tradition, rabbis and scholars are inspired by God to come to the right conclusions.
Right? Our job is not to always say, well, maybe we're going to get it wrong and therefore don't try. Understand that we are human and our job is to study the Torah as much as we can understand, and God does the rest, allows us to tap into that energy that he gave at Mount Sinai to Moses, where each and every person will have that divine inspiration to reach the correct conclusion. Beautiful. With that, we conclude this beautiful class. And please feel free to join us next week. We will follow along with lesson number 8. Same time, same place. Next class will be about where does Torah belong? Where does it apply? Where is its source, or not source, where is its location that it should feel this is where it is talking about? This is where it's referring to. Okay, all the best. Have a great week.
All the best.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.
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 Thank you.
All right.
Bye-bye.